In the early 1880s, on the western edge of Central Park in New York City, a single building stood alone in the wilderness. Around it, there were no grand avenues, no elegant townhouses, only wooden shanties, goat pastures, and empty lots stretching toward the Hudson River. Rising from that barren landscape was a massive structure, heavy, silent, uncompromising. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. New York's elite looked at it and laughed. They called it madness. They gave it a mocking name, Clark's Folly. By every standard of the time, the building should not have existed. The wrong place, the wrong moment, and most of all, the wrong people. The wealthy did not live in apartments. They lived in private mansions, behind iron gates, behind stone walls, and never under the same roof as strangers. But less than 10 years later, every apartment inside that building was occupied. There was a waiting list, and the structure once ridiculed had become one of the most desired addresses in Manhattan. So what changed? This is not just the story of an old building. It is the story of the moment America's wealthy were persuaded to abandon an old way of life and accept a form of living they had once despised. Behind that shift was a fortune born of scandal, a vision of the modern city decades ahead of its time, and an architecture designed not merely for living, but to redefine power and status. And then many years later, at the entrance to this very building, a gunshot echoed through the night, forcing the entire world to remember its name in a way no one ever expected. This building was nearly destroyed, once dismissed as a mistake, once mocked as an embarrassment. Yet it still stands, before it became a symbol, before it became a legend, before it became part of New York's collective memory. Its story begins with one man, one industry, and a decision an entire city believed was insane. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like and subscribe to support the channel. Now let us turn back the clock to where it all began. The scandalous fortune, the sewing machine scandal. In 1811, in a small town in New York State, Isaac Merritt Singer was born. He was born into poverty and received little formal education. At the age of 12, Singer left home. No stable profession, no degree. Only one thing drove him forward, the desire to be known. For nearly 20 years, Singer drifted across America with traveling theater troupes. He dreamed of becoming a famous actor, but the stage did not bring money. What it gave him instead were other skills, the ability to persuade, the ability to perform, and a recklessness unrestrained by social convention. By the late 1840s, Singer was no longer an actor. He became a wandering mechanic, taking jobs in machine shops in Boston and New York. Not out of passion for engineering, but because those were the only places that paid reliably. In 1850, at a machine shop in Boston, Singer was asked to repair a sewing machine made by Leroux and Blodgett. The machine already existed, but it performed poorly. It could only sew straight lines. It jammed easily. It was unsuitable for real production. Singer did not repair it. He took it apart. Within 11 days, working 18 to 20 hours a day, Singer built a new prototype. This machine could sew continuously. It could handle curves. It did not need to stop between stitches. A skilled operator could produce approximately 900 stitches per minute. In the mid-19th century, that number was revolutionary. Singer did not invent the sewing machine, but he was the first to turn it into a truly productive industrial tool. In August 1851, Singer secured a patent. A new industry was born. But a patent does not create money. And at this point, Isaac Merritt Singer had little more than an idea. No factory, no working capital, no distribution network. To manufacture at scale, Singer needed capital. To sell widely, he needed legal structure. And to protect his invention in a field crowded with patent disputes, he needed a lawyer. That is where Edward Clark enters the story. Clark was a commercial attorney practicing in New York, specializing in patent law and industrial contracts. He was introduced to Singer through the very legal disputes surrounding sewing machine patents, an industry that was expanding rapidly but chaotically in the early 1850s. Singer made an immediate impression, not through discipline, but through audacity. Clark saw two things in him. First, a recklessness capable of destroying everything. Second, an invention powerful enough to create an entirely new market. In 1851, the two men formally partnered, founding I.M. Singer Company. Singer contributed the invention. Clark contributed capital, legal protection, and business structure. It was a tense alliance from the beginning. Singer made decisions by instinct. Clark demanded contracts, accounting, and control. Yet it was precisely this opposition that formed the foundation of the empire to come. Clark quickly recognized a hard reality. A sewing machine priced at more than $100 could not be sold conventionally. At a time when a middle-class American family earned roughly $500 per year, the machine was far beyond reach. If sold outright, the market would collapse. And here, Clark made the decision that changed everything. Instead of requiring full payment up front, Clark proposed a business model that had never existed in American commerce. Customers would make a small initial payment, then pay monthly installments until the machine was fully theirs. The decision was not merely bold, it was extremely dangerous. The company had to pay for production in advance, deliver machines before receiving full payment, accept the risk of default, bankruptcy, or disappearance. So where did the money come from? Clark relied on three things Singer lacked. First, legal credibility and access to credit. Clark used his reputation and banking relationships to secure short-term financing for initial production. Second, centralized large-scale manufacturing. By investing in factories, the company reduced per-unit costs, creating room for long-term installment sales. Third, a network of local agents and collection systems. Singer machines were not simply sold. They were leased to own, backed by contracts, agents, and monthly collection. This was not simply the sale of sewing machines. It was the invention of America's installment consumer model. Within a few years, Singer machines appeared in hundreds of thousands of American homes. Revenue grew exponentially. Cash flowed steadily each month, independent of one-time sales. While Edward Clark built systems, Isaac Merritt Singer built families. Not one family, but many. In Manhattan during the 1850s, Singer maintained at least 4 households simultaneously. Each had a different address, each woman believing herself to be his lawful wife. Singer fathered at least 24 children with 5 different women. The families were unaware of one another. For years, he moved between homes with a level of audacity that bordered on the unbelievable. Dining with one family one night, sleeping with another the next. No documentation, no elaborate concealment. Only confidence and social silence. Everything collapsed in 1860. On Fifth Avenue in broad daylight, Mary Ann Sponsler, one of the women who believed she was Singer's wife, saw him riding in an open carriage with Mary McGonigal. The confrontation unfolded in public. The press intervened. Police investigations followed. What emerged shocked New York. Not a single affair, but an entire parallel network of families. Singer was investigated for bigamy and adultery. Before the case reached trial, he left the United States. In Europe, Singer did not become poorer. He became richer. The entire business system Edward Clark had built in America continued to operate. Factories kept producing. Dealers kept selling. Installment payments continued to arrive every month. Singer did not need to be present in the United States to control the company. His ownership and profits were protected by contracts and law. Scandal and prosecution were left behind across the Atlantic. In 1863, Singer married Isabella Boyer, a French woman several decades younger than him. Some later accounts suggest she may have inspired the Statue of Liberty, though no direct evidence confirms this claim. Singer built an enormous estate in England known as the Wigwam. He lived there in aristocratic comfort until his death in July 1875. At the time of his death, Singer's fortune was estimated at $13 million US. Adjusted for modern value, that sum exceeds $300 million today. Singer's will provoked further controversy. Approximately 20 surviving children inherited portions of the estate, but not equally. One son who supported his mother during legal proceedings received only $500. Even in death, Singer left disorder behind. But from that disorder, Edward Clark emerged with control. He had managed the Singer Company for years. He understood cash flow. He understood scale. And he understood that this fortune could be transformed into something entirely different. Not machinery, not factories, but the Dakota. The Dakota was a massive residential project Clark intended to build in Manhattan. A building without precedent in the United States. Not for laborers, not for immigrants, but for the wealthy. The money that built the Dakota did not come from old aristocracy. It did not come from inherited land. It came from a new industrial fortune. And from scandals that 19th century society was willing to tolerate. But money was only the beginning. Because what Edward Clark was about to do with that fortune was what would force New York to confront itself. And that is where the story turns in a different direction. Edward Clark, when power does not need to be loud. As Isaac Merritt Singer became the center of scandal, Edward Clark quietly disappeared from the headlines, not because he mattered less, but because he did not need to be seen. Clark was born in 1811, the same year as Singer, but his path could not have been more different. He was trained as a commercial lawyer in the strictest sense. He worked in a world of contracts, patents, and ownership structures. Clark did not invent, he organized. From the earliest years of their partnership, Clark never behaved like an equal partner in the emotional sense. He behaved like a systems architect. While Singer moved constantly, changing addresses and personal relationships, Clark fixed everything else in place. Where factories were built, whose name appeared on patents, which banks handled the money, who could sign, who could not. This difference created a paradox. The company bore Singer's name, but it increasingly operated on Clark's rhythm. By the late 1850s, the Singer Company was no longer dependent on invention. It had become a financial machine that could be predicted. Money did not arrive seasonally. It did not depend on promotional cycles. It arrived monthly from hundreds of thousands of households. This detail matters. What Clark owned was not sewing machines. It was recurring cash flow. And that cash flow allowed him to do something very few wealthy Americans of the era could do. He could be absent. When Singer left the United States in 1860, the company did not collapse. It did not wobble. It did not slow down. Everything continued exactly as before. This was the moment when real power revealed itself. A company that functions smoothly when its founder disappears is a company that has outgrown the individual. After Singer's death in 1875, Clark did not take control with grand announcements. There was no public restructuring, no dramatic rebranding. He changed nothing, because the system was already doing what it was designed to do. By this time, Edward Clark was in his 60s. He was one of the wealthiest men in America, controlling assets worth tens of millions of dollars, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Yet Clark did not pursue more factories. He did not chase new industries. He observed New York at the end of the 19th century, a city expanding outward, land becoming more expensive, housing turning into a burden. The wealthy lived in large private homes, but they were trapped by them. Private heating systems, full household staffs, constant maintenance, costs that never ended. Clark did not see luxury in this arrangement. He saw the inefficiency of personal management. This was the moment when a new value took shape, never declared, never written down, yet guiding every decision that followed. Luxury was no longer about owning more. It was about managing less. Clark had already done this with the Singer Company. Now he wondered whether the same logic could be applied to housing. Not for the poor, not for the middle class, but for the wealthy, those who had money but no time. The idea ran against American social norms. The rich were expected to live in private houses, with gates, with personal servants. Clark did not argue against this in theory. He prepared to challenge it with a building. But to do so, he needed two things: a location no one wanted, and a structure large enough to make people forget they were sharing it. That was when Edward Clark looked west of Central Park, toward a place most New Yorkers barely considered part of the city. And there another decision was about to be made. An idea against its time, Clark's folly. In the 1870s in New York City, the word apartment was not neutral. It was associated with immigrants, with laborers, with families crowded into dark tenements, deprived of light and air. The wealthy did not live in apartments. They lived in mansions, private townhouses along Fifth Avenue, with gates, servants, and carriage houses behind them. In New York's social order at the time, sharing a roof with strangers was not merely inconvenient. It was seen as a loss of status. This assumption rarely needed to be stated. Everyone understood it. Edward Clark did not accept it as truth. For years, Clark observed European cities that had matured centuries before America. In Paris, the wealthy lived in grand residential buildings along central boulevards. Entire floors belonged to single families. Large spaces, high ceilings, stone balconies, shared staircases, but not shared status. In London, detached mansions were not the only measure of prestige. In many elite districts, shared buildings were accepted, provided the quality of living met elite standards. In Vienna, collective housing for the upper class had existed since the early 19th century. Social rank was not defined by a private gate, but by the quality of life behind the door. Clark did not copy Europe, but he retained one essential insight. In these cities, shared living did not diminish wealth. Only crowded living did. New York was different, at least at that moment. Early experiments were cautious. In 1869, the Stuyvesant Apartments were built on East 18th Street. They targeted the comfortable middle class. The building was clean, modern, and well-managed, and it succeeded. But it did not break a social rule. It merely expanded options for the middle class. The wealthy stayed away. Edward Clark understood this limitation clearly. To change elite behavior, he could not build something merely good enough. It had to cross a psychological threshold. In 1879, Clark conducted his own test. A building called the Van Corlear Apartments, near 7th Avenue and 55th Street. Van Corlear was not ostentatious, but it was carefully designed. Generous space, quality materials, centralized management. Each unit cost approximately $8,000 to build, equivalent to more than $200,000 today. The building filled quickly, quietly, without scandal. Still, it was not enough. Van Corlear proved apartments could exist. Clark wanted to prove apartments could represent the peak of luxury. To do that, he had to go further. Not only in concept, but in location. By every real estate standard of the era, the site Clark selected for his next project was a mistake. Distance was the first barrier. From Lower Manhattan's commercial center to 72nd Street, a pedestrian needed more than an hour. Horse-drawn carriages were unreliable. Omnibus service was inconsistent. For the upper class, social life did not revolve around the home. It unfolded in clubs, theaters, ballrooms, and offices. A place that could not be reached easily could not sustain social standing. The second barrier was social infrastructure. The Upper West Side had no luxury shops, no established pool of servants, no elite social network. The wealthy did not merely buy houses, they bought an environment, and here that environment did not yet exist. The third barrier was land valuation. Land west of Central Park was far cheaper than land to the east. Not because it was overlooked, but because investors considered it too risky. In real estate psychology, cheap land often signals a mistake, and there was a final risk, rarely stated aloud. There was no precedent. No luxury apartment building had ever succeeded in a district without an existing elite community. If this project failed, Clark would not only lose money, he would prove that America's wealthy could not be persuaded. So why did he choose this site? Because Clark saw three factors others ignored. First, Central Park was permanent. It could not be built over. It could not be replaced. Living across from Central Park meant a view that could never be taken away. In a city that constantly grew taller and denser, this was an irreplaceable asset. Second, 72nd Street represented the future. One of the widest crosstown streets in Manhattan at the time, nearly 100 feet wide, sparse now, but destined to become a major axis of movement. Clark did not buy a street. He bought a trajectory. Third, timing. In 1879, the 9th Avenue Elevated Railway began operation. For the first time, the Upper West Side gained a direct, regular connection to the rest of Manhattan. Other investors saw cheap land. Clark saw a district about to be pulled into the city's orbit. The social reaction unfolded exactly as expected. Newspapers mocked the project. Real estate circles called it madness. The nickname Clark's Folly spread faster than construction itself. The upper class responded with silence. No objections. No support. They simply stayed away. To them, the location was wrong enough not to deserve discussion. Edward Clark did not respond. He did not argue with words. He needed only to do one thing: build. If the structure was large enough, different enough, location would no longer be a weakness. It would become part of the story. From this point on, the question was no longer where. It was what would rise on land dismissed as a mistake. And to answer that, Clark needed an architect bold enough to turn risk into authority. That was when the name Henry J. Hardenberg appeared on the drawings. Architecture as Power, Hardenberg's Fortress. When Edward Clark decided to build the Dakota, he was not looking for an architect to decorate a project. He was looking for someone who understood how to use architecture to control human perception. That person was Henry Janeway Hardenberg. Born in 1847, Hardenberg was trained in the European architectural tradition, where buildings were not merely places to live, but instruments for establishing social order. He did not commit himself to a single stylistic language. He chose style based on the message of authority a building needed to project. For the Dakota, that message was unmistakable. Not warmth, not invitation, but impenetrability. The building was not designed to welcome. It was designed to make people pause before entering. Its overall form was a deliberate synthesis. German Renaissance elements conveyed weight, permanence, and defense. French chateau influences introduced proportion, rhythm, and aristocratic gravity. There were no glass facades, no open, flowing balconies. Only thick walls, deep-set windows, and an imposing mass. The Dakota looked more like a fortress than a residential building, and that was entirely intentional. The materials were chosen not merely for appearance. Solid yellow brick, heavy sandstone, intricately molded terracotta. These materials were dense, durable, and resistant to change. They sent a clear signal. This was not built for impermanence, but the true power of the Dakota was not on its exterior. It was embedded in its internal layout. Upon passing through the gates, residents did not enter a hallway. They entered a central courtyard. This space separated the building from the street. Noise diminished. The rhythm of the city was interrupted. This was not a matter of convenience. It was a threshold, a transition from the city to a private domain. The porte cochere allowed carriages to pass directly inside, shielded from rain, snow, and public view. Residents did not step down into the street. The street was not allowed to approach them. Inside, Hardenberg designed a system of strict circulation. Residents moved along one set of paths, servants along another. Goods followed their own routes. Waste was removed through separate channels. These paths never intersected. This was not merely comfort. It was social hierarchy constructed in brick and stone. The apartments themselves were not standardized. There was no sense of shared living. Each unit had a distinct layout: large rooms, high ceilings, private circulation. Residents did not feel they were renting a fraction of a building. They felt they were occupying a private estate, embedded within a larger structure. But architecture alone was not enough. Clark and Hardenberg understood that if they wanted to persuade America's wealthy to abandon private mansions, the Dakota had to surpass them in technology. In the early 1880s, reinforced concrete floors combined with iron beams were extremely rare in residential construction. The Dakota employed them. This structure did more than improve durability. It enhanced sound insulation, reduced vibration, and created a sense of solidity. To further suppress noise, mud from Central Park was used as an insulating layer between floors. A crude solution, but an effective one. The Dakota had its own electrical system, at a time when electricity was still uncommon. Central heating allowed consistent temperature control, eliminating reliance on individual fireplaces. Hydraulic elevators moved slowly but reliably, ensuring residents did not climb endless staircases like those in the tenement buildings. None of this was loudly advertised. It was understood. Anyone who entered the Dakota sensed it immediately. This building was not designed to please everyone. It was designed to exclude. High rents, strict rules, uncompromising space. Architecture here was not neutral. It was a social filter. Not everyone with money could live in the Dakota. Only those willing to accept order, privacy, and control. And that was precisely what made the building a symbol. Not of noisy opulence, but of quiet power. Yet one question remained unanswered. Would New York's wealthy actually choose to cross that gate? Because building a fortress was one thing, convincing people to live inside it was another. And that was when the Dakota faced its greatest test. Life inside a palace under one roof. When the Dakota was completed in the early 1880s, what truly shocked New York's wealthy was not its exterior. It was life inside, because the Dakota was not designed as an ordinary rental building. It was designed as a palace, divided into private homes. The moment one stepped into an apartment, the sensation was not of shared living. It was of privacy. Interiors were finished with hand-carved wood, not mass-produced materials. Each apartment had its own fireplace, positioned as the center of domestic life, not as a temporary source of heat. No two apartments were identical. Size, layout, orientation, and light were all different. This was intentional. Clark and Hardenberg understood that the wealthy would never accept the feeling of living in a mold. Each residence needed to feel as if it had been designed for one family alone. But the interiors were only the first layer. The true power of the Dakota lay in its services. Not services meant to impress, but services meant to liberate. Inside the building itself was a private dining facility, allowing residents to eat without ever leaving home. Meals were delivered to individual apartments via dumbwaiters, small concealed service elevators. Residents did not need to manage kitchens. They did not need to supervise servants rushing through corridors. Laundry, repairs, maintenance were handled centrally. The Dakota functioned as a self-contained service machine. To sustain this system, the building required a vast human infrastructure. More than 150 full-time employees worked within its walls. Managers, engineers, cooks, attendants, cleaners. By the standards of the time, this workforce rivaled that of a luxury hotel. But the Dakota was not a hotel. There were no transient guests, no strangers passing through. Every service existed solely to support a carefully selected group of residents. This distinction mattered. The Dakota was not selling convenience. It was selling freedom from burden. In private mansions, wealthy families governed entire domestic kingdoms. Servants, heating systems, supplies, repairs. Every failure flowed back to the owner. The Dakota reversed this completely. Residents no longer managed people. They no longer managed space. They simply lived within it. This represented a fundamental shift in how luxury was defined. Luxury no longer meant owning more. It meant caring less. Clark never framed this as social reform. He issued no manifesto. Yet by reorganizing daily life in this way, the Dakota quietly made an offer. The wealthy could live magnificently without becoming caretakers of their own wealth. For many elite families, this promise was both tempting and unsettling. Could life remain secure without controlling every detail? Could privacy survive when operations were entrusted to a building? And most of all, could living under one roof erase the distinctions that define social class? This was no longer a question of architecture, nor of location. It was a question of identity. And here the Dakota entered its real test. Not whether it was beautiful, but whether New York's wealthy were willing to accept a new way of living, wrapped inside a palace under one roof. The answer would come quickly, and it would determine whether the Dakota was a failed experiment or a model that would reshape the future of American residential life. The man who built the dream but never lived inside it. In 1882, while the Dakota was still a massive construction site on the western edge of Central Park, Edward Clark fell ill. He was staying in Cooperstown, the family estate in upstate New York, nearly 400 kilometers from Manhattan. Clark was 70 years old. Most of his business career was already behind him. The Singer Manufacturing Company was running smoothly, cash flow was stable, his reputation was firmly established. But the most ambitious project of his life was still unfinished. By that point, the Dakota's structural shell was complete. The buff-colored brick walls stood firmly in place. Its fortress-like outline was already visible against the skyline of the Upper West Side. Yet inside, the building remained empty. Interiors had not been installed. Service systems were not yet operational. The life Clark envisioned still existed only on paper. On October 14, 1882, Edward Clark died of malarial fever, a disease that was still dangerous in 19th century America. He never walked through the porte cochere archway. He never stood in the central courtyard. He never lived in the apartment designed for himself. Clark's death was more than a personal loss. It created a dangerous vacuum of power in the middle of an unfinished project. At that moment, the Dakota represented an investment of roughly $2 million in 1880s currency. Adjusted to modern value, that sum exceeds $60 million. A vast asset, a gamble still unresolved. According to Clark's will, ownership of the Dakota was left entirely to his grandson, Edward Severin Clark. This decision was not accidental. Edward Clark had no surviving direct male heir prepared to assume control of such a complex undertaking. The closest successor he trusted was his grandson, the child of a Clark family member long connected to the Singer fortune. Edward Severin Clark was only 12 years old, a child too young to sign contracts, too young to manage property, too young to deal with banks, contractors, or public scrutiny. Under these circumstances, control could not pass directly to the heir. Instead, the Dakota was placed under the authority of trustees. In the American legal system of the 19th century, trustees were fiduciaries, individuals entrusted with managing property on behalf of another. They were not owners. They did not personally profit from the asset. Their responsibility was to preserve, operate, and protect the property until the legal heir reached adulthood. Clark had appointed these trustees in advance through his will. They were typically close associates, lawyers, financial advisors, men who understood Clark's approach to money, risk, and long-term planning. What matters is not their individual names. What matters is the decision they made. The trustees possessed full authority to reduce the scale of the project, cut costs, or even halt construction entirely to safeguard the fortune of a minor heir. Many New York real estate ventures had collapsed in precisely this way after the death of their founders. But the Dakota did not. The trustees chose not to downsize. They did not simplify the interiors. They did not transform the building into a cheaper version of itself for faster financial recovery. They continued construction exactly as Clark had planned. Every system remained intact. Every architectural detail was executed. Every promise of a palace under one roof was honored. Clark was gone, but his will continued to govern the project through those entrusted to act in his place. This moment marked a turning point in the story. Had the trustees chosen caution, the Dakota would have become an unfinished monument. Had they hesitated, Clark's folly would have proven an accurate insult. Instead, they moved forward, and that quiet decision carried the Dakota through the most fragile moment of its existence. Edward Clark never lived to see the Dakota open its doors. But from the moment of his death, the project ceased to be a personal experiment. It became a legacy awaiting judgment. The question was no longer whether Edward Clark had been right. It was whether New York itself was ready to accept the dream of a man no longer alive to defend it. The answer would come when the Dakota finally welcomed its first residents, a success no one expected. When the Dakota was completed in 1884, the prevailing expectation in New York was not success. It was a control failure. Investors believed the building would take years to fill. The social elite assumed no one of their rank would willingly move west of Central Park. Newspapers expected a costly lesson in building in the wrong place, at the wrong time, for the wrong people. Even Clark's quiet supporters hoped only for a modest outcome. No one predicted what happened next. In the fall of 1884, the Dakota officially opened for occupancy. There was no grand promotional campaign. No founder stood behind the project to reassure the public. Edward Clark had been dead for nearly 2 years. There was only the building and the market. Within weeks, leases were signed. Then faster. Then so fast that real estate agents struggled to keep up. By the time the Dakota formally entered operation, not a single apartment remained vacant. Not 80%, not nearly full, completely full. A building once mocked as Clark's Folly opened with a 100% occupancy rate from day one. The shock deepened when the numbers became clear. Annual rents at the Dakota ranged from $1,500 to $5,000. In the 1880s, the average American family earned roughly $500 per year. In other words, a Dakota apartment cost 3 to 10 times the annual income of an ordinary household. If the Dakota had failed, the financial explanation would have been obvious. But it did not fail. It sold out instantly. There was no trial period, no price adjustment, no slow, embarrassing silence. Reality overturned every prediction. The first resident list confused observers even further. Not old European aristocracy, not names listed among New York's 400. Instead, lawyers, brokers, merchants, factory owners, coal operators, men and families enriched by industry and commerce. People who valued time and order more than inherited social ritual. They were the first to move in. New York's newspapers were forced to change tone. Publications that had mocked the building's remote location rewrote their assessments. The New York Daily Graphic called the Dakota one of the most perfect apartment houses in the world. The real estate record acknowledged that the market had moved faster than critical opinion. No one spoke of madness anymore. No one repeated the word folly. What had once been labeled a mistake was now recognized as construction ahead of its time. The significance went beyond rental numbers. The Dakota delivered a message the city could not ignore. New York's wealthy had never rejected apartment living itself. They had rejected apartments that lacked status. The Dakota did not persuade them through argument, nor through advertising. It persuaded them through experience. It transformed the apartment from a symbol of necessity into a symbol of control and privilege. Once that was proven, the ripple effect began. Land values on the Upper West Side rose. Developers who once laughed grew silent. Then they began calculating. The Dakota was no longer a single building. It became a market signal, a marker showing that the standards of elite living in New York had shifted. Edward Clark was not alive to witness this moment, but the Dakota answered for him, not with explanation, but with a fact so undeniable that the city itself had to rethink its assumptions. The Clark era, 77 years without a single vacancy. After its unexpected success in 1884, the Dakota entered a phase almost without precedent in New York real estate history. A phase that lasted 77 years. Not a single vacant apartment. Not one downturn that created a gap. Not one crisis that broke the chain of occupancy. This period became known simply as the Clark era. Ownership of the Dakota remained with the Clark family, first under Edward Severin Clark after he reached adulthood, and later under successive members of the family. What astonished observers was not that the Dakota continued to succeed, it was how it was managed. The Clark family did not treat the Dakota as a machine for maximizing profit. They did not constantly raise rents. They did not squeeze short-term revenue. They did not exploit scarcity to pressure residents. As Manhattan property values climbed decade after decade, rents at the Dakota remained relatively stable compared to other elite addresses. This was possible for one reason. The Dakota was not the Clark family's primary source of income. Their greater wealth continued to flow from Singer Manufacturing Company, one of the largest industrial firms in the United States at the time. In other words, the Dakota did not need to exhaust itself to survive, and that choice produced a rare consequence. Residents stayed, families moved in and remained for decades. Children grew up in the same corridors. They married, and in some cases, they took new apartments within the same building. Over time, the Dakota formed a closed community, not in the sense of isolation, but in the sense of continuity. The resident list changed slowly. When apartments did become available, they were filled almost immediately by referrals, acquaintances, or families who had been waiting for years. From 1884 to 1961, there is no recorded year in which the Dakota experienced a true vacancy rate. This remained true even as New York shook repeatedly. The financial panic of 1893. The Great Depression beginning in 1929. Two world wars. While many buildings were forced to lower rents, subdivide apartments, or change function to survive, the Dakota retained its residential structure. Not because it was immune to history, but because its model did not depend on short-term cash flow. The Clark family treated the Dakota as a legacy asset, not a speculative investment. Residents understood this instinctively. They did not live in a building waiting to be sold. They lived in a place maintained at a slow, steady pace, predictable, and secure. Over time, the Dakota acquired a rare quality. It was no longer just housing. It was belonging. Relationships formed in elevators, in the courtyard, at annual gatherings. The Dakota became a village standing in the middle of Manhattan. Quiet, unadvertised, unconcerned with proving itself. That silence became its greatest strength. And here lies the central truth. 77 years without a single vacancy was not because the Dakota was flawless. It was because it was never treated as a commodity. The Clark family unintentionally demonstrated a principle that contradicts modern market logic, that in certain cases, refusing to maximize profit creates maximum stability. But no stability lasts forever. When the Clark era came to an end, the Dakota would face a challenge greater than any downturn it had survived. Not from the market, not from architecture, but from ownership itself. And that was the moment when the story turned in an entirely new direction. Nearly destroyed. The rescue of 1961. In 1960, the Clark era came to an end. Stephen Carlton Clark died at the age of 78. He was the last member of the Clark family to directly control and shape the fate of the Dakota. Stephen Clark did not leave behind a direct heir actively involved in managing the family's real estate holdings. More importantly, long before his death, he had transferred the majority of the family's assets into the Clark Foundation. The Clark Foundation was established by Stephen Clark in 1931 with a long-term mission focused on art preservation, education, and American cultural heritage, particularly in Cooperstown. This was not a sudden decision. Beginning in the 1930s, Stephen Clark gradually removed the Dakota from the traditional family estate structure, placing it under the ownership framework of the foundation. The reason was not simply the absence of a single heir. It was a matter of asset governance philosophy. The foundation structure allowed assets to be managed continuously, protected from fragmentation across generations, and insulated from individual personal decisions. By the time Stephen Clark passed away, the Dakota already belonged to the Clark Foundation in legal terms. There was no inheritance dispute. No successor within the family stepped forward to assume control, and this shift placed the Dakota inside an entirely different system. The Clark Foundation was a charitable organization. Under New York state law at the time, charitable foundations were not permitted to retain assets that did not directly serve a public benefit, especially properties requiring high maintenance costs without generating proportionate returns. The Dakota, under Clark family management, had always been operated with stability rather than profit maximization. Rents were kept below elite market levels. Service costs were high. Maintenance was continuous. From a foundation's perspective, the Dakota was no longer a strategic asset. It became a legal and financial burden. By late 1960, the board of the Clark Foundation reached an unavoidable conclusion. The Dakota had to be sold. The asking price was approximately $4.5 million, equivalent to more than $45 million today. But the residents' fear was not centered on the number. It was focused on the identity of the potential buyer. Real estate developer William Zeckendorf, one of the most powerful figures in post-war Manhattan, expressed interest in acquiring the site. Zeckendorf was known for a single strategy: acquire central land, demolish existing structures, build higher, larger, newer. In his development logic, historical value carried little economic weight. The news spread quickly through the corridors of the Dakota. A building that had stood for nearly 80 years, surviving financial panics, wars, and depressions, now faced the risk of being erased from Manhattan's map. For the first time in its history, the Dakota was no longer protected by its founding family. And the residents understood one thing clearly. If they did not act immediately, there would be nothing left to save. In January 1961, private meetings began. Lawyers, publishers, diplomats, artists, people who had never imagined they would need to rescue the place where they lived. The initial idea sounded nearly impossible. To buy the building themselves? The residents decided to form a housing cooperative, a legal structure allowing them to jointly own the Dakota through shares. Each apartment represented ownership. Each resident became a co-owner. There were no protests, no slogans, only tense negotiations, financial calculations, and irreversible decisions. In April 1961, an agreement was reached. The residents agreed to purchase the Dakota for $4.8 million, a higher price than developers were prepared to pay. Not everyone could afford to buy shares. Some residents were forced to leave. The Dakota was saved, but at the cost of a permanent transformation of its residential structure. In November 1961, the transaction was completed. For the first time in its history, the Dakota no longer belonged to a single family. It belonged to the people who lived inside it. Next door, an adjacent parcel of land was sold to another developer. A modern building rose, taller, newer, and that could very well have been the Dakota's fate had the rescue of 1961 not occurred. From this moment on, the Dakota entered a new era, one in which power no longer rested with the founding family, but with those permitted to pass through the iron gates. Hollywood turned the Dakota into a legend. After the rescue of 1961, the Dakota entered an entirely different phase of existence. It had escaped demolition, but at the same time it began to move beyond the role of a purely residential building. By the late 1960s, Hollywood took notice, not because of the building's history, but because of its image. The thick yellow brick walls, the heavy iron gates, a courtyard that felt sealed off from the city. The Dakota projected an atmosphere that was both historic and unsettling. In 1968, director Roman Polanski selected the Dakota as the primary filming location for Rosemary's Baby. Roman Polanski, born in 1933, was a Polish filmmaker known for his psychologically dark style, focused on fear embedded within ordinary life. In the film, the Dakota does not appear under its real name. It is renamed the Bramford, but the image is unmistakable. The imposing facade, the shadowed archway, the long, narrow corridors. The story follows a young couple who move into a luxurious Manhattan apartment building. From the outside, everything appears perfect. From the inside, the space gradually becomes claustrophobic, uneasy, and uncontrollable. Rosemary's Baby avoids loud horror effects. Instead, it places fear directly inside spaces associated with wealth and order. And the Dakota, with its heavy enclosed architecture, becomes the film's silent character. When the film was released, it quickly generated a global impact. Rosemary's Baby earned more than $33 million, an extraordinary figure compared to its $3.2 million budget. More importantly, the film permanently etched a new image into the public imagination. The Dakota was no longer simply a building once mocked, then saved from destruction. It became a symbol of luxury intertwined with unease. From that moment forward, the Dakota carried an additional layer of meaning. No one officially labeled it haunted, but no one viewed it as just another elite apartment house. Tourists began to linger outside the gates. Cameras tilted upward toward the facade. Whispered questions followed. Notably, the residents did not attempt to capitalize on the building's fame. No advertisements, no guided tours, no commercialization. The gates remained closed. That silence only amplified the legend. Hollywood accomplished what architecture and history alone never had. It transformed the Dakota from a controversial structure into a global cultural icon. From this point on, the building's image no longer belongs solely to its residents or to architectural historians. It lives simultaneously in the imagination of millions around the world. But Hollywood had only opened the first door, because just over a decade later, the Dakota would become associated with a real event. Not on screen, but directly outside those iron gates. An event that blurred the boundary between legend and tragedy beyond recognition. The building of creators. After Hollywood turned the Dakota into legend, the building began to attract a very different kind of resident. Not new tycoons, not real estate developers, but people who live by imagination. Actors, musicians, performing artists. Quietly, the Dakota became a refuge for American creativity. The first name to draw public attention was Boris Karloff. Born in 1887, Karloff was a British actor who became globally famous for portraying Frankenstein in the 1930s. He moved into the Dakota after his film career had passed its peak. Karloff was not searching for visibility. He needed privacy. Security. Distance from the stage lights. Thick walls. Well-insulated apartments. A discreet staff. The Dakota offered all of it without asking questions. After Karloff, a new generation followed. Lauren Bacall, one of Hollywood's defining screen icons, made the Dakota her home after decades in the public eye. Born in 1924, Bacall embodied the golden era of American cinema. Inside the Dakota, she was no longer an image on a screen. She was a resident, walking through the courtyard, exchanging brief conversations with neighbors, living a life without a script. Her presence marked a shift. The Dakota was no longer simply a residence for the wealthy. It became a place for the famous who wanted to disappear from fame. Around the same time, music entered the building. Leonard Bernstein, composer and conductor born in 1918, took up residence at the Dakota after becoming one of the most influential figures in American music. Bernstein was known for works like West Side Story and for leading the New York Philharmonic. But inside the Dakota, he was not a maestro. He was a neighbor in need of space to think, to write, and to listen. Large apartments, high ceilings, distance from street noise. The building allowed creative processes to unfold quietly. What stands out is this. The Dakota never promoted itself as a home for celebrities. There were no plaques, no official resident lists, no stories told for publicity. Its reputation spread through artistic circles by word of mouth. Those who needed privacy were guided here. Those who needed silence were protected. Over time, the Dakota developed a rare quality. It became a place where creators could live like ordinary people. Not as symbols, not as legends, just behind closed doors with sound kept inside. That concentration added another layer of meaning. The Dakota did not produce art. It preserved space for art to exist. And as more influential names attached their lives to these walls, the building gained an unofficial identity, a place where power did not come from money, but from the ability to create something that remains after the lights go out. Yet that same silence drew attention to the iron gates, because only a few years later, an event would occur right there that would bind the Dakota to more than creativity. It would bind it to a tragedy that shook the world. John Lennon and Yoko Ono. In the early 1970s, the Dakota welcomed a pair of residents whose presence immediately drew attention far beyond New York. John Lennon, born in 1940, musician, singer, and co-founder of the Beatles, one of the most influential figures in 20th century music. With him was Yoko Ono, born in 1933, a Japanese artist working in performance and conceptual art, already well established in New York before meeting Lennon. They moved into the Dakota in 1973. At the time, Lennon had recently left England, carrying global fame and a personal life constantly under public scrutiny. The Dakota offered exactly what they needed: a gated building, staff accustomed to discretion, apartments large enough for privacy to truly exist. Life for Lennon and Ono inside the Dakota did not resemble that of a celebrity couple. No parties, no media appearances, no turning the apartment into a public stage. They lived by a steady, quiet rhythm, walking through the courtyard, working inside their home, closing the doors when the city grew loud outside. By the mid-1970s, a pivotal decision was made. John Lennon withdrew from popular music. In 1975, their son Sean Lennon was born. Lennon chose to step away from the recording studio, pause writing and performing, and become a full-time father. The decision ran counter to the usual trajectory of music icons. At the time, Lennon was only 35 years old. His career could have extended for decades. But inside the Dakota, he chose a different role. Mornings began in the kitchen. Days unfolded around a young child. Music temporarily disappeared from public life. For nearly 5 years, Lennon was largely absent from major musical activity. The city outside continued to move. Inside the Dakota, time slowed. But the silence did not last forever. In 1980, John Lennon decided to return to music. The album Double Fantasy was recorded, marking his first major reappearance after years of quiet. It was released in November 1980. It was not a loud declaration. The music was personal, mature, focused on family, love, and everyday life. Critics noted the change. Public attention began to return. John Lennon once again stepped beyond the gates of the Dakota. This time, he was no longer the rebellious symbol of the 1960s. He appeared as a man who had experienced enough silence to understand the value of speaking. No one knew this would be the shortest phase of the final chapter of his life. The Dakota, once a refuge of privacy, was approaching a moment that would bind its name to world history. And that story did not unfold inside the apartment. It unfolded directly in front of the iron gates, where so many eyes had already learned to pause in silence. The night of December 8th, 1980, began like an ordinary day in John Lennon's new life. That morning, he gave interviews to the press, speaking about his return to music after years of silence. That afternoon, John Lennon and Yoko Ono went to Record Plant Studio in Midtown Manhattan. They continued working on unfinished recordings. There was no concert schedule, no public appearance, just another long studio session, like many in the weeks before. At approximately 10:50 p.m., they left the studio and headed back to the Dakota. The distance was short. When the car stopped at the western entrance of the building, there was no crowd, no spotlight, just the familiar gateway they had passed through hundreds of times. John Lennon stepped out first. He walked through the iron gate toward the main entrance. And it was in this space, a space long considered safe, that an irreversible event occurred. John Lennon was shot outside the entrance of the Dakota. There was no warning, no confrontation. It happened in seconds. Ono was there. People nearby reacted almost immediately. Police and an ambulance were called. John Lennon was taken to Roosevelt Hospital, only a short distance away. He died shortly afterward, at the age of 40. The news spread across Manhattan within minutes, then across the United States, and soon across the world. No long explanation was needed. The name John Lennon was enough to stop a generation. At the Dakota, the iron gates closed. It was no longer simply a symbol of privacy, no longer just a refuge of quiet. The building entered another role. It became a site of collective memory. In the days that followed, flowers covered the sidewalk outside the gate. Fans stood in silence. No chanting. No performances. Just standing there. The Dakota held no memorial service, posted no signs, issued no statements. It remained silent, as it had for nearly a century. But from that night onward, the Dakota was no longer just a building. It became permanently tied to a moment when music, fame, and violence converged in a very small space. A gate, an entrance, a single moment. And from that point forward, the story of the Dakota could no longer be told without returning to that night. What is striking is that the Dakota did not change. It did not become an official memorial. It did not turn itself into a monument to tragedy. It remained a place where people live. And it is this continuity that raises the final question. How can a building carry both ordinary life and the memory of a global tragedy without collapsing under it? That is the question the next chapter must confront. Strawberry Fields Forever. After the night of December 8, 1980, the Dakota closed in on itself. But just across the street, another space began to open. Only days after John Lennon's death, Yoko Ono made a decision. Not a ceremony, not a monument. She chose to dedicate a section of Central Park, directly facing the Dakota, to create a place of remembrance. Not only for John Lennon, but for memory itself. The location selected was a teardrop-shaped piece of land at the park's southwest corner, between 72nd Street and Central Park West. It was not a prominent site. Before 1980, it was simply a quiet patch of green, a place where John and Yoko often walked. That ordinariness was precisely why it mattered. Yoko Ono did not donate a structure. She donated meaning. In 1981, the city of New York officially named the area Strawberry Fields. The name came from a song John Lennon wrote in 1966 while still a member of the Beatles. A song about childhood memory, about the fragile boundary between reality and imagination. But this is where the story turns. Strawberry Fields was not designed as a traditional memorial. There is no statue, no biographical plaque, no long explanation. Instead, Yoko Ono invited the world to participate. More than 120 countries sent plants, stones, or natural materials to Central Park, a garden that did not belong to America, but to a global memory. Yoko Ono contributed approximately $1 million to build and maintain the site. Adjusted for present value, this represents an investment of several $1 million to preserve a space of quiet. At the center of Strawberry Fields lies a circular marble mosaic. It was crafted in Naples, Italy, by traditional artisans. At its center, there is only a single word. Imagine. No name, no date, no political symbol. Just one word, a word that was once a song, now an invitation. The mosaic is not fenced off. It is not protected by glass. People can stand on it, sit beside it, leave flowers, play music. Strawberry Fields does not demand silence, yet it consistently creates it. Each year on December 8th and October 9th, the day John Lennon died and the day he was born, the crowds return. There is no formal ritual, no central organization. People arrive from many countries, speaking many languages, singing the same songs. Memory no longer remains inside a building. It spreads into public space. The Dakota stands on one side of the street, Strawberry Fields on the other, one enclosed, one always open, one defined by private life, the other by collective remembrance. That symmetry has turned this corner of the city into one of New York's most distinctive sites of memory. There are no large signs, no official explanations, yet everyone who stands there understands why they are there. Strawberry Fields does not tell the story. It holds space for the story. And in that quiet space filled with people, the Dakota and Strawberry Fields exist as two halves of the same history. One is where everything ended. The other is where memory learned to live on. The most exclusive address after the tragedy of 1980, the Dakota did not fade from New York. It entered a different state, no longer just an old building, no longer merely a famous address. It became a legacy locked in place by law. In 1969, the Dakota was officially designated a New York City landmark by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. This was not a symbolic title. The designation meant that any change to the exterior, facade, materials, or architectural layout required formal approval from the city. Ownership was no longer absolute. From that moment on, the Dakota no longer belonged solely to those who owned it, but in part to the urban memory of New York City. 3 years later, in 1972, the Dakota was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This federal register recognizes sites with national significance in history, architecture, or culture. Unlike city landmark status, this listing does not outright prohibit alterations, but it creates an invisible boundary. Any project involving federal funding, public infrastructure, or large-scale redevelopment must evaluate its impact on the Dakota. The building was no longer seen only as a residence, but as a historical asset of the United States. But this is where the story turns. In 1976, the Dakota reached the highest level of recognition. It was designated a National Historic Landmark. This status is granted to fewer than 3% of all properties on the National Register. Not every historic building qualifies. This designation affirms that the Dakota holds exceptional national significance, irreplaceable, and impossible to replicate. From that point forward, demolishing the Dakota became virtually impossible, both legally and politically. 3 layers of protection overlapped: city, federal, history. The Dakota was preserved not as a museum, but as a place where people live, anchored firmly in time. Yet the real power of the Dakota does not lie in its landmark plaques. It lies in who is allowed to live inside. After its conversion to a cooperative, the Dakota came under the governance of a resident board. This board holds the authority to approve or reject any prospective buyer. No public explanation required. No formal appeals process. Money is a necessary condition, but it has never been sufficient. Over the decades, the names of those rejected have become nearly as legendary as those who were accepted. International music stars, A-list actors, elite athletes, not because they lacked wealth, but because the board feared attention, media intrusion, and disruption of the building's quiet life. The Dakota does not oppose fame. It opposes invasion. Those who are accepted are typically those capable of disappearing behind the iron gates, even if they are famous elsewhere. This decision changed everything. It is this mechanism that has made the Dakota one of the most inaccessible addresses in the United States. Financially, the value of the Dakota has risen in ways Edward Clark could never have imagined. In the 21st century, apartments here have sold for several $1,000,000 to more than $20 million. Annual maintenance fees can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet numbers alone do not explain it. The true value of the Dakota does not lie in square footage. It lies in the right to be there. A right that cannot be purchased directly, cannot be auctioned, cannot be forced. The Dakota does not advertise, does not market itself, does not cultivate an image. It exists as a silent system of social filtration. Money may open the first door, but it does not guarantee passage through the second. In a city that constantly seeks visibility, the Dakota endures as a paradox. The more famous it becomes, the more discreet it remains. The more protected it is, the harder it is to reach. And it is precisely this that has made the Dakota the most exclusive address of all. Not because of luxury, but because of the power to refuse. The Dakota was never just a building. It was a way of living chosen again and again across generations. A choice to leave behind the private mansion and accept life alongside others, inside a space governed by rules, architecture, and silence. Here, luxury is not about owning more. It is about having less to manage. No private staff, no personal maintenance burdens, no daily responsibility of running a private estate. The Dakota sold the wealthy something different. Not square footage, but freedom from responsibility. But the cost of that freedom was clear. Privacy was no longer absolute. Choice was no longer entirely individual. Life unfolded within a carefully controlled system, subtle yet firm. That is why this story still matters today. Not because of how expensive the Dakota became, but because it shows that modern power does not come only from money, but from the ability to design how others are allowed to live. In an era obsessed with visibility, the Dakota chose withdrawal. In a city defined by constant motion, it remains still, and that stillness became its legacy. If it were you, would you trade a part of your personal privacy for lightness, security, and freedom from the invisible burdens that wealth so often brings? There is no single answer. If you want to continue exploring mansions, buildings, and families, where power is expressed not through noise, but through architecture, law, and silence, the next videos on screen go deeper into that world. If this story gave you something to think about, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment with your perspective. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story.